Up next, viewers, we're getting you some very important images that are now coming in from the Romanian border as well. The movement of the armored vehicles in this video can be seen on the territory of Romania in the direction of Ukraine. Now, remember, viewers, these are important visuals coming in since this is, in fact, the first time that NATO had activated the NATO response force that had landed in Romania. And in fact, France had been leading the kind of support, the military support that has been pledged to Ukraine, as well as the 300 million euros that have also been pledged from France to Ukraine in light of the Russian invasion. And now these vehicles that we can see, the armored vehicles, clearly moving towards Ukraine, really signifies that help is on its way for Ukraine as we speak. And the NATO response force, really collective defense and deterrence that they are following, in fact, NATO's activation of its defense response plans amid the biggest security crisis in Europe in decades. And now we see those visuals on your screen, viewers, a very signifying visual of the armored vehicles that are now moving towards Ukraine, signifying and telling the world, in fact, that the help is on its way, even as the very crucial meeting of NATO, in fact, is underway in Brussels. We see that France, that has pledged the highest readiness element to the NATO response force, can also be seen with respect to how multinational force comprised of up to 40,000 land, air and maritime special operations personnel that NATO can now deploy at short notice as well. And we see those armored vehicles very clearly moving towards Ukraine, signifying to the world and to Ukraine specifically that help is on its way. And President Zelensky, remember, viewers, had always from the very beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine had talked about how he does not basically need a ride from the US when the US had asked him to help with his evacuation, but he had in fact said that he needs ammunition, and that particular help in fact seems to be on its way when the President Zelensky had stated that more ammunition and more fighter jets and all of the other military equipment is required in Ukraine. Now we see the movement of armed vehicles from Romania to Ukraine moving on. Shivani Sharma also joining me on the broadcast. Shivani, now we see that the NATO response force, in fact, that had been deployed in Romania, we see the armored vehicles that are now making their way towards Ukraine, signifying that help is in fact on the way. And this comes in the backdrop of a very significant talk that is taking place between the Ukrainian delegation and the Russian delegation, from where you're reporting, Shivani.
Priyanka, we've seen that how NATO has been lining up in action since the war broke out, though it decided not to send its units inside the territory of Ukraine and stay limited to the supply of weapons, arms, ammunitions, and stay on the borders for any kind of action that may result. So now, after the second round of talks that have again failed, and the attack continues from Russia's side on the 9th day inside Ukraine, creating a lot of devastation and a lot of civilian casualties and the military casualties, and the kind of attack that happened yesterday night in Ukraine on the nuclear power plant. So now this emergency meeting that is going to happen in Brussels, Belgium, where we've seen that Jens Stoltenberg will be making some very important statements in view of the preparedness of NATO, and now how can NATO get involved in this particular operation to help and reach out to Ukraine. Because, you know, NATO was preparing since last 20 days, because after Ukraine boundaries were being seen, that Russia was lining up its attack forces on the border. Since then only NATO had started preparing for this particular strategy. And now they say that they have around 40,000 troops inside Ukraine and help Ukraine. The decisions will be made today when the summit is over, when the leaders will be meeting, when the NATO members will be meeting here. And the Secretary of State from the United States has also reached here, Antony Blinken, and he will also participate, because we know that NATO and United States military has been closely allying to help Ukraine in the time of crisis. And there has been a lot of criticism also over how NATO has not entered the territory yet with its troops. But now, as we see the movements of these tanks, movements of these armored brigades on Romania, and last week also there were some forces that had landed on different locations. Right now we are in Poland, and here also there are around 6 major bases of NATO in which the exercises are going on. Without disclosing much, the NATO forces are now claiming that they are ready for any kind of action once the leaders in this summit decide what's to be done and how to go about and help Ukraine. It will be a major step coming in from NATO at this point in time, as we see the crisis aggravating inside Ukraine with Russia's escalating attacks, not only on the military areas, but also on the civilian buildings. So it is quite important as to what NATO decides today in this particular summit in Brussels. And remember, this is an emergency meeting that's taking place, Priyanka. So very important one indeed. Around 30 nations of NATO will now decide how to help Ukraine, when President Zelensky has been calling it since the demand of help since so many days. Now I think after 9 days and the failed talks, NATO has woken up, and after the meeting they might made important statements regarding their plan of action.